Jessica had dreamed of becoming a doctor since childhood, and she definitely wanted to be a surgeon, not a therapist or a traumatologist. When her mother was young, she used to work as a nurse in a local clinic, which couldn't help but arouse Jessica's interest during her school years. She often tried on her mother's scrubs and admired herself in the mirror. "Miss Brown, the clamp, please. Miss Brown, I admire your talent," the girl improvised, pretending to be a well-known surgeon. Of course, it was just a fantasy at first, which had nothing to do with the girl's reality. But over time, she managed to make those dreams come true. Jessica's success made her mother, Priscilla Brown, extremely happy, especially since the woman had raised her daughter all on her own. After graduating from med school, Jessica completed her residency and got a job in the local surgical department at one of the local hospitals. "I'm very proud of you, honey. Now there's a real doctor in our family," the woman said proudly. Her mother's words always made Jessica blush, and her heart literally tremble with the realization of her own importance. The only thing that brought the young woman down and made her anxious was her mother's health problems. As soon as she got to work, the young surgeon showed herself as a responsible and qualified doctor. And that was even despite the fact that Jessica wasn't allowed to perform complex surgeries on her own at first and could only assist the more experienced surgeons. Nevertheless, the woman never lost heart and was determined to achieve her goal, to become the best surgeon in the department. It was then that Derek appeared in Jessica's life. He was the chief's son and was used to behaving however he pleased. Frankly speaking, Derek was a terrible surgeon, and the only reason he was never fired was because of his father. Most of the time, he didn't even show up to work at all, and even if he did, he was always a couple of minutes or even hours late. Derek knew that any complicated surgery would always be entrusted to a more experienced surgeon, and since his father's position in the medical world was still stable, the young man wasn't afraid of anyone or anything. What he liked about Jessica wasn't her surgical talent, but rather her impressive, memorable appearance. The young woman had beautiful blue eyes and involuntarily attracted male attention wherever she went, always getting countless compliments. Derek started expressing his interest in Jessica as soon as she got the job at the hospital. Moreover, he did it very rudely, which, quite expectedly, didn't get him anywhere with the young surgeon. "You shouldn't be so mean to him. He could easily ruin your career," Jessica's colleagues told her. But Jessica wasn't planning on advancing her career by getting involved with the chief's son. First of all, she wanted to achieve everything on her own through her hard work and talent. But Derek wasn't about to give up so easily and persistently continued to pester Jessica with his attention. He showered her with expensive gifts and bouquets of roses, which only got bigger and more expensive every day. But Jessica was firm in her decision and wasn't going to get in a relationship with an entitled young man. At that point, she didn't yet realize what a huge mistake that was and believed that she could get out of that predicament scot-free. Meanwhile, Derek held a grudge and decided to get back at the young woman who rejected him so boldly. The young man had never been rejected before in his life and was used to always getting whatever and whomever he wanted. Derek saw himself as a sort of a warrior on the love front who collected women's hearts instead of medals and awards. It took Derek about a week to fabricate accusations against Jessica. Moreover, everyone who had to take part in the setup clearly didn't want to do it. Unfortunately, most of them couldn't go against the chief's son, and thus, when Jessica was called in by the chief, her bewilderment knew no bounds. She never once came to work late, and she was always emphatically polite and efficient with her patients. When the poor woman heard that she was being accused of stealing medicines, she was terrified. "How is that possible? I always handed in the empty vials as per protocol." The young woman tried to object. Francis Miller gave the woman in front of him a contemptuous look and said, "I prefer to trust facts and not speculations or rumors. I can't have a surgeon who is capable of such criminal negligence work at my hospital. If you want, you can stay in the department as a nurse. If not, you're free to go, but don't forget that all the other hospitals in the city will be notified of the situation with the missing medicine and will know that you were responsible for it." It was only then that Jessica realized what a trap she had fallen into. Of course, the young woman could get into a fight with the chief and slam the door on her way out. But where would that get her? Especially considering that Jessica's mother was showing signs of a formidable hereditary disease. If I'm left without a job, what's going to help my mom? Jessica thought. It wasn't an easy decision to make. The poor woman could barely hold back her tears as she accepted the position as a nurse in the department. At that moment, Francis Miller saw himself as a very powerful person who could control other people's fate. Meanwhile, Derek was beyond happy to see Jessica get demoted. Now he was pretty much the star at the surgical department. Deliberately making fun of the young nurse, the chief's son forced her to do as much work as possible, which would actually require a couple of employees. By the end of the day, Jessica literally couldn't stand on her feet from exhaustion and was ready to fall asleep right at the hospital. Back home, she tried not to tell her mother about her problems at work so as to not worry her and make her condition even worse. It's fine. One day, it'll all change. Jessica tried to stay positive. On the other hand, she understood that as long as Derek had so much control of the department, there would never be any order or discipline there. At some point, the chief's son crossed the lines and even started infringing on the right of the chief of surgery. He did it all with the silent approval of his father, who made sure Derek had all the power he wanted. Derek loved the night shifts the most because he could freely flirt with the nurses and have parties in his office. Jessica knew that it would get him into trouble eventually, but as long as Francis Miller was the chief, he would always have Derek's back. Meanwhile, all that was left for the young nurse to do was perform her duties to the best of her abilities and reminisce about the times when she was a surgeon. Every day, the young woman had to remind herself that she needed this job to help her sick mother. If she weren't so desperate, she would have probably quit a long time ago and forgotten all about medicine. When Derek wasn't at the hospital, Jessica asked the other surgeons to let her observe the surgeries they performed. She didn't dare to ask to assist them. All she wanted was to at least stand in the room and watch them operate. The woman was very afraid of forgetting everything she had studied at the university. Deep down, Jessica believed that one day her life would change and she would get her former job back. Once, on a warm April night, a very strange patient was admitted to the hospital. It happened after closing. There was a loud and persistent knock on the hospital door. Jessica was on call that day, and she immediately rushed to the door. She was very surprised to see two men standing at the door, holding a third man who was apparently very sick. The patient turned out to be a young man of about 25. He was holding his stomach and groaning softly from time to time. He started feeling bad on the street. We didn't want to call the ambulance and decided to bring him to the hospital instead. One of the men explained, catching the nurse's anxious look. Since the patient was holding his hand on the right side of his abdomen, Jessica suspected that it could be an acute appendicitis attack. There was no time to waste in such cases, since any delay in treatment could lead to complications, such as peritonitis and blood poisoning. At that moment, Jessica seemed to have forgotten that she was just a nurse and asked the men to put the patient on a gurney standing in the corner of the room. Then the nurse thanked them for their help and rolled the gurney with the patient straight into the operating room. Jessica asked the patient a couple of questions along the way in order to pinpoint the location of the pain and make the final diagnosis. Since the symptoms of appendicitis are fairly easy to determine, Jessica was confident in her diagnosis. The situation was complicated by the fact that Derek Miller was on call that night. However, the man was pretty drunk by that time and could barely see straight, let alone perform any surgeries. Since there were only nurses besides Jessica on call at the hospital, they decided to immediately take the patient into surgery. Jessica took a quick shower and put on a sterile surgical gown. Giving out orders to the nurses during the surgery, the woman was very confident and concise. No one in the operating room had any doubts about her skills. The nurses were well aware that Jessica used to work as a surgeon, and therefore they didn't ask her any uncomfortable questions and simply did what she told them to. Jessica's diagnosis turned out to be correct. In her own opinion, if the surgery had been delayed even for another hour, the patient could have faced terrible consequences. The most interesting thing was that Derek simply slept in his office during the entire time of the surgery and had no idea what was happening at the hospital. It was only the next morning when it turned out that a patient named Bill White had had a surgery the night before that Derek realized that he'd missed something very important. How could he have gotten the surgery? Who performed it? Derek growled, looking defiantly at the attendants. "Jessica Brown did it, sir," one of the nurses said, stammering at every word. At that moment, Derek turned red in the face. Soon, Francis Miller got word of the incident. Without a moment's hesitation, the man fired Jessica for arbitrariness. "I've had enough of you. First you steal drugs, and now you're putting a patient's life in danger. I think it's time for you to forget about medicine altogether," the chief said, barely keeping his anger in check. But Jessica didn't care. The woman knew that she'd saved a man's life and that Derek couldn't have done it given the state he was in. Since Bill came to his senses only an hour ago, Jessica simply didn't have time to talk to him yet. After leaving the hospital, the young woman decided that it was time for her to leave medicine behind. But what happened next set off a chain reaction that led to some very unexpected consequences. It all started with the fact that Bill White's father came to the hospital. He turned out to be a congressman who was away on a business trip. Alfred White only found out what had happened to his son in the morning and immediately took the first flight in. According to other doctors, Jessica performed the operation flawlessly, and therefore Bill's father wanted to personally thank the surgeon who saved his son's life. Francis Miller was quite taken aback. However, an interesting idea popped into his head. "It was my son who performed the surgery, sir." The chief lied without batting an eye. The devious man didn't take one thing into account. Alfred White had already talked to his son on the phone and was well aware of the fact that the surgery was performed by a young nurse named Jessica. What happened at the chief's office later was whispered about by the hospital staff for days to come. When the congressman realized that the chief was trying to deceive him, Francis Miller was immediately removed from his post. The chief was soon followed by his son, who was so drunk at the moment that he couldn't even comprehend what was happening. One day, Francis Miller felt that he ruled the universe, and the next day he was out on the street, humiliated and out of work with his reputation ruined. The very next day, Jessica was reinstated and appointed the chief of surgery. After getting discharged, Bill White personally thanked the surgeon for her help and professionalism. Soon, a relationship flared up between Bill and Jessica, which went through a difficult path from ordinary friendship to spiritual and physical intimacy. Alfred White always decided to help women who saved his son's life and paid for Priscilla Brown's treatment at the best hospital in the country. Jessica and Bill started spending more and more time together, diving headfirst into a romantic relationship. Of course, they didn't fall in love overnight. Not a day passed that Bill didn't thank Jessica, who inadvertently saved the life of her future husband. 6 months later, the young people had a beautiful wedding, which was the logical continuation of their incredible story. Meanwhile, Francis Miller and his son ended up working as orderlies at a psychiatric hospital, as it was the only place that would hire them after what they did.